Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that sounds like a very strange, very dark fever dream, but it's actually one of the most successful pranks ever played by a military. So go ahead and dim the lights, adjust your pillows, and maybe sink just a little bit deeper into your blankets. Tonight, we're drifting back to 1943, to a world of foggy London streets, secret basement offices, and a plan involving a very quiet, very dead man who was about to go on a very important business trip. We're talking about Operation Mincemeat. It's a tale of high-stakes espionage, but told through the lens of people who were essentially professional liars with a dry sense of humor. Let's just relax and let the cold, damp air of wartime Britain carry us into the narrative. The year is 1943, and the Allies are in a bit of a pickle. They want to invade Sicily because, well, it's the soft underbelly of Europe, but the problem is that the Germans also know that Sicily is the soft underbelly of Europe. It's the obvious choice. It's like playing a game of hide and seek where you hide in the only closet in the house. You're gonna get caught. So, the British intelligence officers, specifically a pair named Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, decided they needed to convince Hitler that the Allies were actually going to attack Greece and Sardinia instead. Now, how do you convince a paranoid dictator that you're doing the exact opposite of what you're clearly doing? You could send a telegram, but he'd know it was a trap. You could send a spy, but spies get caught. No, Montagu and Cholmondeley decided the best messenger was someone who couldn't be interrogated, someone who wouldn't get nervous under pressure. They decided they needed a corpse. Because why not? If you're going to commit to a lie, you might as well go for the full weekend at Bernie's approach. They needed a body that looked like it had died in a plane crash at sea. It had to be someone whose death wouldn't be missed, someone whose family wouldn't raise a fuss. They eventually found a man named Glyndwr Michael. He was a homeless man from Wales who had died after eating some bread crusts smeared with rat poison. It was a lonely, tragic end, but for the British Secret Service, it was exactly what they were looking for. Now, they couldn't just throw Glyndwr into the ocean and hope for the best. They had to give him a life. They had to turn this poor, forgotten man into a high-ranking Royal Marine officer. They named him Captain, acting Major, William Martin. And because the British are nothing if not thorough, they didn't just give him a name, they gave him a personality, a history, and a really messy love life. They filled his pockets with the kind of things a real person would carry. They gave him a set of keys, some stubs from a London theater show, a receipt for a new shirt, and a letter from his bank demanding he pay off his overdraft. Because, of course, even a fictional hero of the British Empire can't escape a grumpy bank manager. It's those little details that make the lie breathe. But the centerpiece of the deception was Pam. They created a fictional fiancé for Major Martin. They got a photo of a pretty girl who worked in the intelligence office and tucked it into his wallet, along with two very affectionate, slightly dramatic love letters. They even included a receipt for a diamond engagement ring from a jewelry store in Bond Street. They wanted the Germans to look at this body and see a man with a future, a man who was loved, a man who had everything to live for, and who just happened to be carrying top-secret invasion plans in a briefcase chained to his wrist. Imagine Montagu and Cholmondeley sitting in their windless office debating the exact tone of a fake love letter, while the fate of Western civilization hangs in the balance. It's a very dry, very British kind of absurdity. The top-secret documents were, of course, beautiful works of fiction. They were letters between high-ranking generals written in that casual, hey old boy style that British officers used to disguise the fact that they were discussing the deaths of thousands. The letters hinted, very strongly, that Sicily was just a feint and that the real target was Greece and Sardinia instead. Once Major Martin was fully born, he was packed into a special canister filled with dry ice to keep him, well, fresh. He was then loaded onto a submarine, the HMS Seraph. The captain of the submarine was told he was transporting a top-secret weather device, because apparently the British military's go-to excuse for "we have a dead body in a tube" is "it's a barometer, don't worry about it." On the morning of April 30th, 1943, off the coast of Huelva, Spain, the Seraph surfaced. The crew was kept below deck, and only the officers went topside. They took Major Martin out of his canister, inflated his life jacket, and gently pushed him into the waves. They even read a psalm over him, which is a nice touch considering they were essentially using him as a piece of bait. The currents carried Major Martin toward the shore, right where the British hoped a pro-Nazi Spanish agent would find him. And find them they did. A local fisherman spotted the life jacket bobbing in the water, and soon the man who never was on a slab in a Spanish mortuary being poked and prodded by officials. The British vice consul in Huelva played his part perfectly. He started frantically demanding the body in the briefcase be returned, acting like a man who had just lost the keys to the kingdom. This, of course, made the Germans and Spanish even more desperate to see what was inside. The Germans eventually got their hands on the documents. They carefully opened the envelopes, using a needle to roll the paper up so they wouldn't break the wax seals, photographed everything, and then put them back. They were convinced. The bank overdraft, the theater tickets, the pining fiancé, the rat-poison bread crust captain, it all seemed too pathetic to be a lie. Hitler himself bought it. He moved his divisions away from Sicily and toward Greece. He even sent Rommel, his best general, to oversee the defense of the Balkans. The Allied invasion of Sicily, when it finally happened, was far less bloody than it should have been, all because of a homeless man and a fake girlfriend named Pam. It's a story of ironic contrasts. A man who had no place in the world in life ended up changing the world in death. A lie built on theater stubs saved thousands of real lives. And Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley went back to their office, probably had a nice cup of tea, and started thinking of the next way to trick a dictator. As the waves gently lap against the Spanish shore and the submarine slips back beneath the dark, cold Atlantic, let's leave Major Martin to his rest. He's earned it. Let's float away from the world of secret agents and submarines and move towards something a bit more stationary. Let's head back in time, to a place where the secrets weren't in briefcases, but in the very blood of the people who lived there. Let's drift toward the royal palaces of Europe, where the only thing more dangerous than a spy was a cousin with a marriage contract. We've talked about Charles II of Spain before, but he's such a perfect example of royal dysfunction that he bears a second, even slower look. If Operation Mincemeat was about a body being used for a purpose, Charles II was a man whose body had been used by his ancestors for centuries before he was even born. Imagine the royal palace in Madrid. It's huge, it's dark, and it's filled with the smell of old incense and heavy chocolate. And in the middle of it is Charles. He was the end of the line, the final sputtering flame of the Spanish Habsburgs. Because his family had spent 200 years marrying each other to keep their land together, Charles's genetic makeup was a disaster. His inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. He was a biological impossibility who somehow made it to adulthood. He was called the Bewitched, but his life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a long, slow struggle against his own anatomy. His jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, was so enlarged that his upper and lower teeth didn't meet. He couldn't chew. He lived on a diet of mostly liquids and soft foods, which he'd swallow with a heavy, wet sound that made the ambassadors at court very uncomfortable. His tongue was also too large for his mouth, so when he spoke, it was a blurred, slurred mess. He drooled constantly. He was, in every sense, a man who was falling apart from the inside out. He had frequent seizures, he was often covered in rashes, and he suffered from a deep, unshakable melancholy. The court around him was a bizarre place. Because he was the king, everyone had to pretend he was a glorious, powerful monarch. They'd dress him in the finest silks, put a heavy gold crown on his head, and carry him to various ceremonies. He'd sit there, slumped in his chair, a pale, ghost-like figure with a jaw that seemed to have a life of its own, while people bowed and scraped and talked about the glory of Spain. It's the ultimate ironic contrast, the ruler of a global empire who couldn't even control his own saliva. The most tragic part of Charles's life was his obsession with his own legacy. He knew he was the last. He knew the world was waiting for him to die. He became increasingly obsessed with the dead. He famously asked to visit the royal tombs, where he had the coffins of his ancestors opened. He spent hours staring at the mummified remains of his father and his first wife's, Marie Louise. He even kissed them. He was looking for a connection to a family that had essentially destroyed him before he was born. When he finally died in 1700, the autopsy report, which we've mentioned before but is worth savoring for its sheer clinical weirdness, described a body that seemed to have been put together by someone who had never seen a human being before. His heart was tiny, his lungs were consumed, and his intestines were rotten and gangrenous. He was 38, but his body was ancient. With Charles's death, the Habsburg line in Spain ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet, wet sigh. The war that followed was loud and violent, but Charles's life was anything but. It was a life of silence, of dark rooms, of soft food, and of the crushing weight of a crown he was never meant to wear. As we move away from the dark halls of Madrid, let's consider the quietness of it all. The way history is so often made by people who are just tired. Tired of lying, tired of ruling, or just tired of their own skin. So, as the silent, long-jawed king finally finds his rest in the royal crypt, let's leave the dusty, inbred halls of Spain and float eastward. The air gets colder, the landscapes become vast and endless, and the rulers develop a very specific, very dramatic sense of flair. We're drifting toward the snowy, candlelit world of Imperial Russia, where the empresses were less about quiet contemplation and more about absolute, unapologetic power. We're talking about Catherine the Great. Now, Catherine was not Russian by birth. She was a minor German princess, plain and overlooked, who was shipped off to marry the heir to the Russian throne, Peter III. Peter was difficult. He was immature, obsessed with toy soldiers, and seemed to genuinely prefer his dogs to his wife. He liked to make Catherine play dress-up with his toy army, and often forced her to stay up all night while he drank and listened to bad German music. It was not a recipe for a happy marriage. Catherine, meanwhile, was clever, ambitious, and utterly determined not to be forgotten. She learned Russian, she read every book she could get her hands on, and she cultivated a network of loyal supporters among the Guards regiments. While Peter was busy making his dogs lie on the dining table during formal dinners, Catherine was quietly building her power base. The inevitable happened. Peter became Tsar. And he was terrible at it. He insulted the church, he alienated the nobility, and he made a lot of very unpopular decisions about the army. So, after only 6 months on the throne, Catherine led a coup. She rode on horseback, dressed in a guardsman's uniform to the barracks in St. Petersburg, and declared herself empress. Peter was quickly arrested and, a few days later, mysteriously died. In Russia, these things just happen, you know? A quick, quiet, convenient death. Catherine was now Empress of all the Russias, and she reigned for 34 years. She was a woman who knew how to wield power, but she also knew how to make it look effortless. She was a patron of the arts, a correspondent with Voltaire and Diderot, and a tireless modernizer. She also had a series of very public, very handsome lovers, which scandalized Europe but seemed to do wonders for her public image in Russia. She was, in many ways, the ultimate example of a woman who was tired of playing by other people's rules. But her court was also a place of subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, cruelties. Catherine was known for her golden cages. If she liked a noble, she would lavish them with gifts, land, and titles, but they would effectively become her property. They were expected to be utterly devoted to her, and if they showed any sign of independent thought, their fall from grace would be swift and silent. Imagine being one of Catherine's favorites. You live in unbelievable luxury, surrounded by art and servants, but you know that one wrong word, one accidental frown, could send you to a frozen estate in Siberia. It's a very specific kind of gilded fear. Catherine herself was a woman of immense discipline. She woke early, worked tirelessly, and managed to maintain an almost superhuman energy despite the incredible demands of ruling an empire. She had her quirks, of course. She loved to ride horses, often for hours at a time, and she was an avid collector of cameos. Her private rooms were filled with them, tiny carved faces staring out from every surface. It's a nice, sleepy image, a powerful empress surrounded by the silent, sculpted faces of ancient gods and emperors. But as with all great empires, there was a quiet, almost imperceptible rot beneath the surface. While Catherine was corresponding with philosophers about enlightened despotism, millions of serfs were living in conditions of abject poverty, essentially as property. The contrast is jarring, but for Catherine, it was simply the way the world worked. As we leave the opulent, candlelit palaces of Catherine the Great, let's float away from the drama of coups and lovers. Let's move toward a place where the rulers were equally obsessed with power, but in a much more singular, much more violent way. Let's head to Sweden, where a king was so devoted to war that he completely forgot about the actual act of ruling. We're going to talk about Charles XI of Sweden. Now, Charles was born in 1682, and he was, to put it mildly, an anomaly. While most kings of his era were obsessed with elaborate palaces, fancy clothes, and luxurious meals, Charles was obsessed with one thing: war. He dressed in a simple blue uniform, refused to drink alcohol, and lived like a common soldier, often sleeping on the ground with his men. He was known as the Swedish Meteor, or the Last Viking. He inherited the throne at 15 and was immediately faced with a coalition of powers, Russia, Denmark, and Poland-Saxony, who decided a teenage king would be easy pickings. They were wrong, horribly wrong. Charles spent the next 2 decades leading his armies across Europe, often winning against impossible odds. He was a tactical genius, but he was also incredibly stubborn and had absolutely no interest in diplomacy. When he defeated Denmark, he didn't demand land or money, he just demanded they promise never to attack Sweden again. When he defeated the Poles, he installed his own puppet king. His greatest enemy was Peter the Great of Russia, and their long, brutal conflict was known as the Great Northern War. Charles was initially victorious, but then he made a classic mistake. He invaded Russia in winter. And as anyone who has studied history knows, you simply do not invade Russia in winter. It never works. It's a very sleepy, very predictable mistake that every ambitious leader makes. His army was decimated by the cold and disease, and he suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Poltava in 1909. Then he fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he spent 5 years trying to convince the Sultan to invade Russia. Imagine that, a king, exiled in Turkey, still obsessed with fighting his old enemy, while his own country slowly fell apart. While Charles was off playing chess with the Ottoman court, Sweden was effectively without a king. The government was run by his sister and a council of nobles, who were mostly just trying to figure out a way to get Charles to come home and, do some actual governing. But Charles had no interest in paperwork. He was a soldier, not a bureaucrat. He eventually returned to Sweden after a dramatic horseback ride across Europe and immediately resumed fighting. He spent the last years of his life trying to rebuild his army and regain his lost territories. He was killed in 1718 during the siege of a Norwegian fortress, likely by a stray bullet. It was rather an undramatic end for such a dramatic life. Charles XI of Sweden left Sweden utterly exhausted, bankrupt, and stripped of its great power status. He was a brilliant military mind, but a terrible king. He was so focused on the battlefield that he completely forgot about the people he was supposed to be ruling.
He preferred the quiet, brutal logic of war to the messy, complicated logic of peace. As we leave the cold, blood-soaked battlefields of the Great Northern War, let's consider the loneliness of men like Charles XI, the ultimate solitary figures driven by a single, all-consuming passion, but ultimately unable